A guard shoved the accused forward, and the parchment strip pinned to his chest did not hold a single letter. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he leaned against the archway and watched the scribe dip his quill. The room smelled of tallow and old ink. The accused blinked under candle glare and did not speak. High Inquisitor Aldrin's voice filled the days as he spoke the measured formula that would seal consequence without a named crime. The first 5 sentences contain the central problem: a man condemned by ceremony though no charge appears on the record. The researcher had followed the tribunal's schedule for 3 nights. He had not expected the accused to be brought in with a blank accusation. He had expected sealed pages, carefully worded indictments. Instead, he witnessed procedure become argument and absence become verdict. He moved from suspicion into a small, stubborn anger. His hand closed around the brass magnifier in his satchel. Aldrin did not look at the accused. He fixed his gaze on the scribe and the sealed ledger at his side. "Read the form," Aldrin commanded. "Let the record stand as presented." The scribe answered with the exact rhythm of ritual, his quill scratching a measured line even where there was nothing to transcribe. "The tribunal records a danger unspoken." The scribe said, "So is the sentence entered." The accused's lip trembled. "Name it," he whispered. "Say what I have done." Aldrin raised his hand. A guard closed the accused's mouth with a flat palm. The researcher slid from the doorway and down the corridor toward the archive after the session ended. He kept his coat collar high. He kept his breathing steady. He had a habit. When suspicion anchored him, he catalogued small certainties: the weight of a seal, the grain of parchment, the angle of a quill. Those details were his path into other people's systems of order. The scribe's footsteps struck slow in the stone. The researcher followed them to the alcove where the ledger rested under a hooded lamp. "You watched," the scribe said without surprise. He set his inkpot between them and did not look up. "Everyone watches." Few asked. The researcher put a hand on the ledger's carved cover. Why was the slip blank? He asked. Why announce a verdict and hide the crime? The scribe's fingers twitched against his quill. "Because words can be dangerous outside the ritual." The scribe replied, "Because names can spread a contagion." "We do not name. We name by consequence." The researcher felt indignation rise into action. He pushed a chair back and bent over the ledger. The scribe removed his glove with a precise motion, revealing ink-stained fingertips. "You want the original slip," he said. "You will not carry it through the hallways. You will not read it aloud. You will not publish it." The researcher counted the scribe's restrictions and set his magnifier on the table anyway. "Give it to me," the researcher said. "I will copy it with only my sight." The scribe looked at Aldrin's seal on the ledger and hesitated a breath longer than necessary. "Then take it where no one can see you now," the scribe said, and he slipped a folded paper across the oak. The folded paper lay cold under the researcher's lamp. He opened it with short, careful fingers. The strip was almost white. Under the lamp's heat he watched the surface as one watches a small animal breathe. Faint strokes lay there, then the strokes sighed and vanished like dust. The researcher blew out the lamp and relit it, testing the paper's reaction. "What did you do to it?" he asked. The scribe did not answer with words, but with a steadying sound, the one produced by tamping wax into a seal. The researcher set the magnifier over the strip and found traces, broken strokes that in one angle suggested a letter, in another angle suggested only an ornament. He tilted the lamp and saw a curling of black that rose faintly and then evaporated along the parchment fibers, a residue like the last breath of ink. His first emotion shift moved from suspicion to a sharpened certainty. The blank was deliberate. He felt it in the way Aldrin had refused to meet eyes during the tribunal, in the way the scribe's hands never trembled. He fingered the ink blot at the edge of the strip and felt a slight raised nib where the quill had scorched the surface. He, the scribe, this is not a mistake. Someone designed the blank. The scribe set his jaw. Design preserves order. The scribe said, "You and I know the law of forms. Take your evidence and leave." The researcher folded the strip back into his coat beneath his magnifier and walked out into the late corridor. Outside the archive, a junior clerk nearly collided with him. "Master Karen," The clerk managed. They burned the verdict on the days. It was... He swallowed. The researcher heard the word he had been avoiding. Ceremony. He pictured the brazier and the flash of flame, and the way ash will carry an accusation away in dust. He tightened his grip on his satchel. Where is the accused now? He asked, taken to the cellars. The clerk answered, they say the sentence was executed immediately. The researcher's mouth went dry. He walked the corridor 2 paces faster, then 3, then broke into a stride that felt like a confession. The next scene was confrontation at the dais, the chapter's scheduled climax waiting like a loaded lamp. The researcher pushed into the tribunal chamber as they were lowering the sealed verdict toward the brazier. He called out once, his voice small, controlled, stop, heads turned. Aldrin's eyes met his with a calculation that did not include mercy. You are not permitted to interrupt, Aldrin, rising. This session is closed to inquiry. I am permitted to question a record, the researcher said, and the word question landed like a measured strike. There followed an argument of hands and words. You interrupt the tribunal, Aldrin. You interfere with ritual. Ritual is not a substitute for law, the researcher answered. Ritual is a tool. You are using it to hide decision-making. The scribe braced his quill as if ready to cut. The accused in the center stilled and glanced at the researcher as if cleaving the room in two. The guards moved outward like a tightening wall. A guard seized the researcher's sleeve. He did not struggle. He wanted to be heard. The rapid exchange unfolded in short lines. Aldrin, the researcher said, you cannot burn what you will not name. You presume to lecture the court. Aldrin returned. You presume an ignorance I do not tolerate. You burn the record and call it justice, the researcher said. You will not justify an erasure by ceremony. Aldrin's jaw worked. You test the tribunal's patience, he said. Scribe, record his words. The scribe dipped his quill and scrawled with the same ceremonial calm as before. The accused made a sound, an almost cry that the guards swallowed with a gloved hand. The second emotion shift moved the researcher's indignation into immediate fear. The brazier flared, and he realized the tribunal could convert his curiosity into complicity merely by spectacle. He lunged forward toward the brazier, and Aldrin stepped between him and the burning slip. Back, Aldrin. This is beyond your jurisdiction. The researcher kept his hand on the strip he had hidden under his coat. He pulled it free with a movement small enough that Aldrin did not see its shape. He held it over the brazier for a single breath, and the heat licked at the edge of the paper. He thought to shout the letters aloud, to force naming into the hall, but the words collapsed in his throat. Instead, Aldrin seized the sealed verdict from the table and slid the blank slip into it, pressing the edge of his seal hard enough that wax cracked. He fed the sealed verdict into the brazier. The flame took the paper and made the room brighter by a notch. It showed every face with a cruel clarity. When the slip curled and blackened, the accused bowed his head. He did not speak. The researcher reached for the burning edge, and Aldrin's siren ring stopped his wrist. The guard's grip tightened. The scribe finished his line and closed the ledger with a thump that sounded like a final order. In the aftermath, ash scattered over the stone like unwanted confetti. The accused sagged to his knees, breathing hard, and the researcher crouched to scoop what might remain. Heat stung his fingers, and the ash fell into the hollows of his palms. He found a small blot of ink clinging to the edge of a curling scrap. It had not burned complete. He lifted the blot and felt it cool between his thumb and forefinger. It held a pattern. Not a full word, not even a full sigil, but a curved stroke and a serrated tail that suggested a symbol seen from a single angle. You persist, Aldrin from the days. His voice had lost some of its ritual cadence and gained a sharp edge. You take fragments and call them evidence. The researcher did not answer at once. He wrapped the blot in a strip of his own notebook and slid it into his satchel. I will trace its provenance, he said finally. I will show what that blank was meant to accomplish. Aldrin's mouth flattened. You will not publish tribunal secrets, Aldrin warned. You will not unmake what keeps order. The researcher met his gaze and said only, order built on omissions is brittle. I will test it. They carried the accused away in silence. The alley beneath the tribunal smelled of damp straw and old rope. The accused's wrists left red lines where the rope had been. He did not speak until they reached the cell door and the guard pushed him inside. "Why won't you tell me what I did?" he asked the researcher in a voice so small it seemed to be airing a confession. "I do not know," the researcher answered truthfully. He had seen the blank strip, the evaporating strokes, Aldrin's movements. He had seen how the procedure converted a person into an object of consequence. He had not seen motive. Back in his study, the researcher unrolled a clean folio and set the blot under the lamp. He sketched the curve and the serrated tail with careful strokes, then compared the mark to other symbols in his notes. He worked by measured light and slow breath, his hands steady even as his mind rethreaded the tribunal's logic. The scribe's submission, words ferried into blanks to protect ritual purpose, replayed in his head. He catalogued possibilities. Concealment to avoid panic. Erasure to conceal an unlawful chain of command, a ritual mechanism to let consequences travel without named cause. Each possibility shifted the angle of dread in his chest. He thought of the clerk's trembling face in the corridor, of the scribe's fingers stained with ink, of the iron seal on Aldrin's ring. He made a list. Aldrin, the scribe, the ledger's seal, the brazier, the blank strip. He wrote the name of the accused in a margin and then crossed it not as erasure but as a record of movement. He set the blot on top of the crossed name and traced the blot's edge with his thumbnail. The pressure of his nail left a small crescent scar on the blot's edge. He realized then that the blot was not merely residue. It had been formed to survive flame at one point and to fall apart at another. Someone had engineered resilience and dissolution. A knock sounded at his door while he was still cataloguing. He froze a beat and then slid the blot under a folded sheet. He opened the door a crack. A junior clerk stood there, wide-eyed and breathless. "Master Karen," the clerk said, using the researcher's formal name, "there is talk in the kitchens. The judges say an external witness saw your intervention. They suspect you of taking the slip." The researcher's mouth tightened. "Who this?" he demanded. "I cannot say." The clerk answered. "They only ask you to come forth and explain." The researcher studied the clerk's face for a moment. Clean hands, a smudge of soot on one knuckle, the exact slope of someone who had been assigned to run messages all night. He let the clerk in. The next paragraphs must produce an external event. The clerk pushed a folded note across the table. "Aldrin sent this with the steward," the clerk whispered. The steward had left it on the bench at the outer hall. The researcher did not open the note immediately. He listened for other sounds. No footsteps, only the steady ticking of his wall clock and the faint creak of old beams. He unfolded the paper and read, "Return the strip. Submit yourself. There will be consequences." The note bore Aldrin's seal. The researcher folded the note and set it by the blot. He felt an unexpected, precise panic. Not for himself alone, but for the accused. The stakes had moved. He called the scribe that night. The scribe arrived with the lamp already lit and a slow, polite gait. "Why did you hand me the strip earlier?" The researcher asked without preface. "Because I thought you would look with the right eyes," the scribe said. "Because one who keeps records must also know when the record is broken." "You knew it would burn," the researcher said. "You knew they would feed it to the brazier." The scribe looked at the blot on the table and then back to the researcher. "We do not always know," he replied. "Sometimes we are instruments. Sometimes we are architects." He dipped his quill and thumbed the rim of his inkpot. They argued in clipped sentences, 3 to 6 rapid exchanges. "Why not name the crime?" the researcher asked. "Because naming inflames more than it clarifies," the scribe said. "Because a name can become a contagion, you call it safety." The researcher answered. "You call it power. You test me with accusation," the scribe said. "You presume you see the design. I see a pattern." The researcher shot back. "I see ritual erasure used to make people obey. I see a process that turns silence into punishment." The scribe's fingers tightened around his quill. At one point the scribe reached into his robe and produced a small folded cipher key. He set it on the table between them. "If you insist on following this, use the key," the scribe said. "It will show you how some phrases are sealed." how ink can be made to vanish, how a blank can be produced from a named text. The researcher took the key and felt its weight in his palm. It was colder than he expected. He thought of Aldrin's seal and the brazier and the accused breathing behind the cell door. The scribe watched him and his face did not change. "Do not mistake me for your ally." The scribe added, "I keep the record." "The record keeps me." The researcher opened the cipher key by lamplight and ran the blot under a drop of lamp oil in a test he had learned as a boy. Oil darkens the fibers, sometimes revealing faint impressions of ink. The blot held a partial curl that, when matched to other symbols in his notes, suggested a sigil used in local penitential rites. It was not a direct accusation word. It was a mark that, when invoked in ritual, converted municipal censure into ecclesiastical outcome. The revelation changed his course. This was not only about concealment but about jurisdiction. Someone had built a bridge between secular accusation and spiritual consequence by using form rather than fact. He packed his satchel and carried the blot to the outer register of his contacts. He named Aldrin to two men who kept soft power in the city, the steward and a cloistered bailiff. Both men lowered their eyes when he said Aldrin's name. "He will not be questioned publicly." The steward said, "He has the seal and the chain. He has ritual authority that checks civic suit." The bailiff tapped his cheek. "You risk more than reputation, Master Karen. You risk the accused. You risk yourself." The researcher set his jaw and said, "Then I will find the record's origin through the ledger's margins. I will map the pattern." They all heard the determination in his tone and understood it as an action, not a threat. Amid chapter mini, cliffhanger appears when he opens a bound volume in the municipal stacks and finds an erased index entry. Where a name should be, only a faint hole remains. He pulls the folio and finds that several entries have been excised with heat and scraped fibers. He reaches for one of the cut slips and finds the same serrated tail on its corner. The discovery shifts the danger. The erasures run deeper and are older than tonight. He realizes he is not chasing a single tribunal decision, but a procedural technique embedded in ledger after ledger. He returns to the scribe with the scraped slips. The scribe shuts the door behind them and says, "I told you they ferry words into blanks. Now you know it is systemic. Why?" The researcher asks, who gains from a system that convicts by blank form? The scribe shrugged and then said, "Imagine a panic that can be contained if it never names itself. Imagine a ruler who can punish without public trial. Imagine belief preserved by omission." The researcher felt anger again, then cold resolve. He wrote down 3 names. Aldrin, the steward, the bailiff. He underlined each once. Night deepened and he worked until his lamp guttered. He catalogued each erased slip, matched the serrated tail to ritual forms, and mapped the pattern across months of ledger entries. Each match tightened a web. He found the accused's name in a margin beside a tithing dispute. He found that the accused had argued with a minor steward 2 months before and had been accused by neighbors of saying things that unsettled local prayers. Those complaints were thin, small, ordinary, and yet they fed into a system that could amplify them into lethal consequence. He closed his book and felt the weight of the evidence like a physical object on his chest. When he at last rose, he wrapped the ink blot in a torn page from his notebook and placed it beneath his brass magnifier. He sketched the serrated tail once more, slower, and then covered the folio. He had resolved the mini conflict. He now had proof the blank was engineered and tied to a ritual mechanism that converted civic complaint into spiritual verdict. He had not yet resolved the larger conflict, confronting Aldrin and dismantling a practice that relied on secrecy. A knock came at the study door, 3 measured knocks, not hurried. The researcher stood and lifted the lamp. He set the blot back in his satchel, zipped it, and moved to the door. He opened it to find no one on the threshold. A folded strip lay on the step with a single wax impression. He picked it up. The wax bore a sigil that matched the serrated tail. He felt the final concrete beat of the chapter as he reached for the strip. Someone had left the sigil where he would find it. He closed the door and slid the strip into his satchel beside the blot. He relit his lamp and began to copy the pattern into his notebook. He did not write a reflective declaration. He catalogued facts. He made choices. He decided to trace the ledger margins, to confront procedural secrecy, and to follow each erased entry back to its point of origin. He would move next toward the brazier suppliers, the seal casting the wax's source. He arranged his tools and checked his satchel one last time. The chapter ended with him sitting and tracing the serrated tale again with a fine pen, the lamp's pool of light a hard circle on the table, and the sound of distant boots from the outer hall that might belong to an ally or to Aldrin. He put down his pen and listened. The boots stopped outside his door. The quill stopped half air above the narrow strip and left no trace. The scribe's hand did not tremble. The nib simply produced nothing against worm-eaten fiber. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he stepped closer, watching the inkless motion with both curiosity and a cautious disbelief that had kept him late in cloister archives for 2 decades. He had spent 20 years mapping marginalia, seal marks and ritual formulas. He had never watched a letter refuse a page. The tribunal chamber smelled of tallow and old ink. A guard held the accused by the elbow. The paper strip remained blank on his chest, and the accused did not move his eyes. The researcher moved to the scribe's bench so the first sentences of the ritual would not be lost to distance. He kept his hand on the edge of the ledger, feeling the warmth of the wood where 1,000 fingers had rested. He wanted proof, not rumor. He wanted the ledger's notation explained in clear terms that could be read and verified. Suspicion, then a second movement, curiosity, pulled him forward. He leaned over the scribe's shoulder and watched the quill's white arc. "Scribe," the researcher said, low enough to avoid the daze, but loud enough for the man at the bench to hear. "What is this strip?" The scribe's lips did not move immediately. He dipped the quill again and rubbed its shaft between ink-stained fingers. He answered with measured economy, "A statement of consequence. A statement of consequence." The researcher repeated the phrase, tasting it for meaning. He had read the phrase elsewhere in faded notes, but never applied to a blank space. "Show me the ledger." He kept his voice steady. Suspicion required evidence, not conjecture. High Inquisitor Aldrin, seated above the dais behind his ceremonial chain, watched without blinking. He tilted his head once as if calibrating the room. The accused shifted on his bonds and let his chin fall. The accused's wrists still bore a faint rope mark. The researcher saw it. He catalogued the bruise below the accused's left eye and the ink flecks on his sleeve. Details, proof. The scribe pushed the ledger toward Aldrin and then, almost involuntarily, slid a folded slip across the bench into the researcher's hand. The motion lasted for a fraction of a breath, and then the scribe resumed the ritual. The researcher unfolded the slip at the edge of the candlelight. The slip held only a smudge of black, a single blurred stroke like a thumbprint. No letters. He pressed the folded paper flat with his thumb and placed it under his notebook page, naming it now in his mind. The instrument of nullification. The chamber had been arranged to make ceremony unavoidable. Hooded attendants lined the walls. A brazier sat on iron chains before the dais. The scribe prepared his inkless gestures. He drew the quill across the air and small curls of smoke rose from the nib as though the ink had become breath. The researcher watched the smoke with an attentive eye. He had seen smoke in ritual before, fumigations, inks washed with perfume, but this smoke climbed directly from the quill and vanished above the parchment surface. He traced the motion of the scribe's hand. Each signal the scribe traced on the paper produced no letter, and yet produced a patterned residue of perfumed air. "Proceed, Aldrin." His voice carried through the room. He did not call the accused by name. He never would. Names could be traced. Consequences could be sealed. The researcher felt a shift from curiosity toward a tighter wariness. He noted the way Aldrin paused between ritual lines and how his hand brushed the iron signet at his belt. There was a practiced sequence here, a choreography designed to convert absence into outcome. The scribe spoke the formula aloud, though no ink joined his words. He shaped glyphs with the quill, and the glyphs folded into smoke, but left no visible mark. The researcher watched the smoke pool and then condense at the edge of the parchment in a faint, oily film that reflected candlelight like a bruise. This was the first arithmetic. Absence of accusation equated to naming of consequence. The accused lifted his chin, the only declaration he made. "Why?" he asked, voice rough from confinement. "Name the charge." "Tell me what I did. You will hear what follows." Aldrin, and his voice filled the vault. "Listen and accept." He recited the ritual consequence in a line so precise that the bench timbers seemed to hold it. The words were not a crime, they were a decree. The researcher watched the accused's jaw clench as those words landed like iron. The accused stammered. "Aldrin," he began. He tried again with a shorter sentence. "Tell me why." Aldrin tilted his head. "You know the shape of these procedures," he said. "We record what is. We do not speculate on why, we do not speculate." The accused repeated, each syllable a small spike. "You can pin a paper to my chest with nothing written and burn it. You can remove my name from explanation and still hang me. Is that law?" Aldrin's face did not soften. "It is ritual law," he said. "Ritual law predates these forms of speech. It predates your petitions." The accused lunged, though the guard's grip held him fast. He spat, "Then write the reasons. For my mother's sake, write them." The scribe dipped the quill again. The researcher stepped in and stopped him with a single, quiet movement. He did not touch the scribe's hand. He placed his palm on the ledger's open margin and turned a page to expose the ledger's edge. He pointed with his thumb toward microscopic marks along the margin, impossible to see from the days but present at arm's reach. They were not letters. They were short ticks and tiny sigils, like a private numbering system. The researcher tapped one and the scribe's fingers hesitated. "Those are marginal notations," the researcher said, aloud but aimed at the scribe. "They are systematic." The scribe's eyes flicked toward Aldrin. "They serve the seal holder," he said. "They are not for public reading." Aldrin's hand moved to the brazier as if to adjust the chain. He did not speak. The researcher read the motion as a threat. The room shifted, attendants shifted their weight, and a small gust of air moved through the chamber as a torch guttered. This was the first external change since the ritual began. The scribe slid a folded slip beneath his ink pot and then, with a visible hesitation that made the researcher look twice, pushed another folded paper across the bench toward the researcher. The researcher felt the paper cold under his fingertips. He unfolded it discreetly and found a ciphered column. Tiny marks between the ledger's ruled lines that referenced page numbers and symbols he recognized from earlier notations in other archives. The scribe watched him, and the watch in the researcher's chest uncoiled into a focused intent. The blankness was purposeful, enforced by a hidden ledger system that defined consequence without cause. The researcher spoke then, not as a solicitor but as a scholar testing a hypothesis. This ledger encodes discretion. It allows the seal holder to define outcome without a recorded crime. It binds the scribe to enact a rigorous procedure. Aldrin's mouth tightened. "You are curious, researcher." Curiosity can be an accusation. That line drew a reaction from the accused. "Curiosity," he barked, "is my life for your curiosity." Aldrin leaned forward and his voice dropped. "You will accept the consequence, or you will be made an example." The accused swallowed. He stared at the blank strip on his chest. He tried to remember how he had come to this hall. He tried to remember which neighbor had complained, which strange rumor had named him, and he found only the faintest traces. A woman at the market had scolded him 2 weeks prior for stepping too close to a child's crib. A man at the tavern had turned his back the evening a sacrificial fowl died of poor care. These were small things that could be folded into accusation if someone chose to fold them so. His mouth opened and closed, his hands clenched at the rope marks until the scab on his wrist flared. The researcher leaned his palm flat on the bench and felt the ink stains there. He felt the ledger's spine like the back of a living thing that had been trained to destroy. He catalogued the scribe's visible hesitation when pushing the folded slip. He catalogued the way Aldrin's eyes tracked the movement. He catalogued the timing. Every ritualed pause allowed a moment for consent or coercion to settle in. He made a decision. He would not speak accusations into a public ledger. He would not name the cause. He would instead record the mechanism. Aldrin began the sealing sequence. He produced a small iron seal and set it over the top of the folded verdict. The accused flinched when Aldrin's hand moved, the guilty reflex of a man who had been touched by an authority before. The scribe chanted the final line and closed the ledger with reverence. The researcher leaned forward to see the ledger's inner edge and found, hidden between leaves, a strip of vellum with numbers corresponding to places where blank verdicts had been applied before. He traced a sequence of marks that connected this accused to others in nearby towns. A murmur rose from the attendants. The researcher recorded the names he could hear. One toller called the accused Joran, though the formal record named no one. The scribe's eyes flicked toward the researcher and then lowered. There it was, a hint. The ledger system tied blank verdicts to social management. The researcher felt a second emotion shift, from wariness to a sharpened dread. He saw then that the blankness was not a failure of ink but a designed erasure, used to remove debate, to make consequence immediate and unappealable. High Inquisitor Aldrin. The researcher said, "Steady now, loud enough to reach the dais. You are converting absence into punishment. What law authorizes this?" Aldrin did not answer at once. He removed the seal from the folded verdict and held it up so the candlelight glinted on the iron. "The law that preserves order," he said finally. "The law that ensures belief endures belief." The accused spat. "You mean fear?" Aldrin's jaw tightened. "Fear is not our province." "We correct error." "Then correct me by name," the accused demanded. "Name the error." Aldrin's answer was immediate. "You broke a bond of faith." He spoke the phrase precisely. It was not a crime enumerated in any code the researcher had catalogued. It was a flexible charge, a catch-all that left the ledger free to define consequence. The accused's face went slack as if the phrase had landed and knocked out thought. He began to rock in his bonds. The guards tightened their hold. The scribe closed the ledger and moved to the brazier. He placed the folded verdict on a small iron plate. The researcher reached for the smudged slip he had kept folded in his notebook. He had to hide it. He had to preserve it. He folded his fingers around it and moved it into a pocket. Aldrin lowered the sealed verdict into the brazier. The metal hissed when heat took hold and a small curl of ash floated up. The researcher watched the ash like a record of the world being reduced. He measured his own pulse, then moved. He stepped forward and took the folded slip from his pocket, and in a quick motion, slipped it into his satchel beneath the wax-stained notebook. The scribe looked up and their eyes met. For a second the scribe's face registered a private rupture, and then masked itself into professional calm. The accused was hauled away after the seal's heat had browned the paper's edge. He strained against his bonds and shouted once, a single line, "Name it!" Then he was dragged down the corridor and the heavy doors shut behind him. The hall seemed to reorient itself around the emptiness he left. Benches closed, attendants shifted, a single torch guttered and flared. The researcher sat back on the bench, hands white on wood, and opened his notebook. He set the smudged slip on the page and wrote one sentence. "A blank verdict enacted by discretionary marginalia equals irreversible consequence." The words were not elegant, but they were precise. He then unfolded the ledger's folded page and transcribed the marginal markings as best he could. He copied the tiny ticks and sigils, the sequence numbers that placed this procedure within a broader system. He wrote until his eyes blurred. The scribe came to the bench with ink on his cuffs and placed a cup of water. He did not meet the researcher's gaze for long. "You saw the notation," he said, in a voice that had been taught to hold few syllables. "You will not name me in the ledger." The researcher nodded without looking up. "I will not name you unless you order me to." The scribe's hands trembled. He glanced toward the dais and then back at the researcher. "There are reasons," he said, "reasons you would not understand. Explain one to me now," the researcher said. The scribe did not answer immediately. He folded his hands and turned them over, showing ink-stained fingertips, and then he spoke in a voice so low the researcher had to lean in to hear. "Once, a ledger saved a village. Once, an absence prevented a massacre. We were taught that silence could spare many." The researcher wrote the scribe's words verbatim. He recorded the claim as a historical memory, not as justification. He watched the scribe press his mouth into a thin line and felt the man's moral fracture as if it were a fresh cut. The researcher made a choice then. He would not only document this ledger, he would decode it, he would follow marginal marks to their sources and show how absence had been weaponized into law. He closed the ledger carefully and slid the smudged slip into the pocket of his cloak. He tucked his magnifier on its cord beneath his robe. Before he could rise, Aldrin called for a brief recess. He called the scribe to the dais and whispered into his ear while the attendants began to move. The researcher watched that exchange, a tilt of the scribe's head, the narrowing of his eyes, the slow nod he gave. The scribe returned to his bench and collected a sealed wax stamp and a new strip of vellum. He did not look at the researcher again. The researcher folded his notebook and stood. Outside the chamber, in a narrow corridor lit by a single sconce, the researcher unfolded the smudged slip once more. He laid it against his palm and traced the faint ridges. He felt a third emotional shift, dread cooled into resolve. He would not yet bring accusation into the open. Instead, he would gather more ledger instances, name patterns, and reveal the system by which a blank page became a fate. He turned the corner and met two attendants who had been on the chamber wall. One of them recognized him and stepped back, giving him space. The researcher inclined his head and kept his satchel close. He carried the ledger's encoded threat like a small stone in his pocket. He would follow it, mapping the ledger's network across towns and seals. He would show the ritualized erasure for what it was, a mechanism of control. He would show who profited when silence replaced explanation. At the threshold of the tribunal doors, he paused. He could still hear, faintly, the scrape of a chair from within. He touched the edge of his notebook again and closed it, breathing once with deliberate steadiness. The scribe's ledger had produced a visible trace in the margin. A folded slip had been shoved into his hand. A verdict had been sealed and burned. Those were concrete events he could follow. He stepped into the corridor and pulled the hood of his cloak low. He set the satchel against his hip and pushed the door of the next archive open. The chapter ends with the researcher slipping the folded slip into his notebook pocket and closing the ledger, then moving down the corridor toward the archives where he plans to trace the marginalia, leaving the brazier's small smoke behind and the sealed verdict reduced to ash in the tribunal's iron bowl. The sealed verdict slid on iron chains toward the brazier while the accused stood with the blank strip pinned to his chest. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw and made him step from the archway into the pool of candlelight. He watched the sealed packet lower, watched Aldrin's hand stay steady on the dais, and felt a change from doubt to urgent curiosity tighten his ribs. He had come because the parchment had shown nothing earlier. The scribe's quill had passed and left no ink, and that absence had become a kind of accusation. The problem was now physical, punishment recorded without a named crime. The occult researcher, he kept his distance but moved closer when a guard shifted, knew the names of methods and forms. He also knew how institutions turned absence into power when no explicit allegation existed. He kept his chin down and his thin spectacles adjusted. He felt suspicion first, then curiosity. Suspicion made him insist on seeing the packet. Curiosity made him ask for a look at the seal. He made the request aloud and let his voice be measured. "High Inquisitor Aldrin," he said, stepping until the floorboards creaked under his weight. "Permit inspection of the sealed parchment." The phrase carried the procedural weight of ritual. Aldrin's gaze narrowed. A guard tightened a hand on the accused's shoulder so the man could not try anything. The accused's eyes flicked once, toward the researcher, then away. Aldrin's reply was slow and exact. "Procedure does not allow reading prior to finalization," he said. "The seal is the court's instrument." His voice was the same cold instrument that had shut down questions in earlier hearings. The researcher heard the syllables as a boundary. He advanced another step. When the researcher reached the dais, he smelled the warm metal of the brazier, the sweet sour of tallow, and the iron tang from the sealed ledger key Aldrin produced. The sealed packet hung above the coals like a dark promise. The scribe sat a pace away, quill ready, ink, pot shadowed and motionless. The researcher remembered the earlier scene. The strip pinned to the accused's chest had lacked any letters. The scribe had let his nib hover and produced nothing on that same fiber. That image was concrete in his mind, no ink, the quill tip glazed with candle soot, and it propelled him to press the court for evidence. "I only ask to confirm the record," the researcher said. "A glance at the seal is sufficient." He forced his hands to stay visible, to look deferential. He had moved from suspicion to a controlled demand. Aldrin tilted his head and regarded him, the ceremonial chain catching the candlelight. The High Inquisitor reached for the sealed ledger key and put it into the palm of his hand as if to show the object that justified silence. "You saw the strip earlier, Aldrin. You watched the scribe's hand. You witnessed the procedure." His words were not a defense but a frame. The accused swallowed and hissed through his teeth. The thin rope mark on his wrist was dark against pale skin. The room waited. Aldrin recited the formal words that legitimize omission. He spoke the formula with the pace of ritual, consonants struck like small blows. The researcher listened for legal cadence and for any slip that might reveal a hidden motive. When Aldrin finished, he produced the sealed ledger key and showed the wax impression to those nearest. The scribe's face did not change. The accused's hands tightened against the ropes. The researcher insisted again, a single measured gaze at the seal, High Inquisitor. "For the record, for my notes," his voice had a softer edge now. He tapped his pen twice, a mannerism he used to collect himself before speech. Aldrin did not refuse outright. He nodded once and allowed the researcher a measured inspection. The scribe lifted the sealed packet and set it on the wooden rail. The candle flame licked the braided seal and made small red sparks against the metal braid. The researcher leaned forward and focused on the wax. Under the seal's edge, the researcher found a narrow fold, a cipher of paper tucked into the crease. He slid his thin fingernail under the wax and broke the corner free, careful to leave the external seal visually intact. The cipher fold had been hidden there as if the seal itself contained a secret margin. He felt a new shift of emotion, curiosity sharpening into alarm, because a hidden fold implied deliberate erasure, not accident. "You hid something in the seal," the researcher said without raising his voice. "There is a cipher fold beneath the wax." The scribe's eyes flicked to his hands. Aldrin's jaw tightened. The scribe made a small involuntary motion. His fingers, ink-stained, steady, trembled once. He met the researcher's gaze, then looked down at the quill. The researcher had moved from curiosity to a combative insistence. Suspicion had become an investigative force. He, the scribe, to open the cipher fold. The scribe's hands went to the wax and hesitated. The scribe's voice was quiet and measured. "It is permitted a glance only. The words are not for the unsealed record." He slid the fold open with careful motions. Inside was nothing like the broad handwriting the court used for public charges. Instead, there were tiny marks in a tight sequence, a notation system. The researcher leaned closer. The lantern light fell on the paper and revealed faint impressions made by a hard, blunt instrument rather than ink. He traced them with his thumb and felt ridges where letters should have been. "These are not blanks," the researcher said. Someone pressed a code into the paper. "These ridges can be read with an impression test." He had thought of the test. He carried a brass magnifier that could reveal indentations. The scribe did not answer with words. He pressed the quill to the side and rubbed a fingertip along the edge of the fold, and the gesture itself was a kind of admission. Aldrin's voice cut in. "What you suggest is unnecessary. The court has observed process." He moved to reclaim control of the packet. The researcher raised his hand to stop him. "High Inquisitor, the record is incomplete without the cipher read. The accused should be able to know the charge if it exists, or at least the mechanism recorded." The researcher did not ask for audacity. He stated the procedural flaw as a concrete risk, an erasure of due form. He had shifted again, his unease now hardened into a professional outrage. The scribe's shoulders bowed minutely. He knew the ledger's methods. He had written and erased in service to ritual language for years. He touched the ink-stained cuffs of his robe, then looked at Aldrin. "You know this method." The researcher said to the scribe, "You have a notation for omissions. Tell me what those marks mean." He held his brass magnifier out with both hands. The scribe licked his lips and let out a breath. He did not refuse. He moved closer and popped the magnifier open with a small click. He did not speak the full meaning aloud. Instead, he drew a finger across the ridge marks and then, with slow deliberation, tapped 3 short strokes on the desk as if signaling a letter. The scribe's small gesture supplied context without full disclosure. The researcher recognized the movement from earlier ledger practices. A pattern formed in his mind. Before the scribe could elaborate, the accused lunged forward, voice raw and urgent. "Please," he cried, "say the word. Tell them what I am accused of. I did nothing." A guard seized him and pushed him back. The rope on his wrist cut into his skin, and he fell silent with a soft curse. His plea was transformed into spectacle. The accused's sudden motion forced the room to react and created a fresh, external event that escalated tension. Aldrin's hand rose. "Silence," he said, and his tone stopped the guard from hurting the man further. He spoke the ritual phrase that reasserted silence. The accused's mouth was closed with the authority of the court. The researcher watched the accused's jaw work under the ropes and felt the man's breath rasp. The accused had attempted speech and had been physically shut down. That moment made the researcher angrier. Aldrin reached for the brazier chain. He spoke the formula that authorized destruction of the packet. The court accepted such acts as purgative, a necessary sealing of danger. The researcher had seen ritual burnings before, instruments of control disguised as purification. He had moved from controlled outrage into a quiet, precise plan. He would catch whatever the smoke revealed. The scribe placed the sealed packet over the brazier with care. The flame took the parchment and the wax softened, smoke rising in a thin column. For a few long heartbeats, the smoke was unremarkable. Then, as ash and ember mixed, a curl of smoke darkened and carved a single word and a small sigil into the air before dispersing. The letters appeared not on paper but in the smoke itself. A hurried, dark trace that lasted a breath. The room inhaled at once. The word hung briefly and then dissolved. The sigil hovered like the shadow of a pressed thumb and vanished. The accused's eyes went wide. Aldrin smiled a small, triumphant smile and lowered his head toward ritual certitude. The researcher felt a sharp internal fracture. Alarm flared into grim comprehension. He had suspected erasure. The smoke revealed that the blankness had been a deliberate cipher. The blank was an instrument. Aldrin used the revelation immediately. "You see the naming," he said. "The court has spoken." He did not read the word aloud. Instead, he read the ritual consequence. The accused turned his face to the researcher, eyes wet with something like pleading and anger. The researcher reached out to touch the accused's sleeve, but a guard stepped between them. The scribe moved with a different, quieter purpose. He reached for his ledger and folded his quill. He began to alter entries the researcher could see. A careful addition here, a faint cross out there. The manuscript language shifted into something that would close avenues of inquiry. The researcher saw that the ritual protected itself by adjusting the record as events unfolded. He had moved from comprehension into a renewed strategy, to keep a fragment of the evidence. After the court dispersed and Aldrin ordered certain documents carried away, the researcher stepped to the brazier and scooped a small, still, warm ash smudge with his gloved fingertip. The ash left a dark smear on his glove. He wiped it on the seam of his cloak, and then tucked a finer portion into the fold of his notebook. He had switched from active interrogation to quiet preservation. Outside the chamber, when the last hooded figure exited, the researcher opened the notebook and set the ash beneath a strip of paper so he could inspect it later. He made no pronouncement. He made notes in compact script, observations, small sketches of the cipher ridges, not guesses but measurable details. He avoided commentary and recorded what he had touched and what he had seen. The wax, the cipher fold, the impression ridges, the smoke, letter that had hovered and burned away. He kept encountering shifts in emotion as the night progressed. Suspicion had drawn him to the days. Curiosity had made him pry at the seal. Alarm had risen when the cipher became intentional. Clarity followed the smoke, and then a hard, pragmatic sadness settled when he saw the ledger adjusted to close inquiry. Each shift moved him to a new set of actions. To demand, to examine, to preserve, to record. He wrote each movement down. When he had finished, Aldrin returned to speak in measured tones. "You preserved what you wished to keep," he said, watching the researcher's hands. "The court will decide how to treat your notes." The researcher met Aldrin's gaze. "You will not alter them without process," he replied. Aldrin exhaled and signaled 2 guards. They took the researcher's satchel and his notebook from him with no ceremony. The researcher felt a small, hot panic, then a constriction in his chest. The guards said nothing and put the items on a table. The scribe picked up the notebook and flipped through it with deliberate slowness. He found the ash and studied the smudge pressed under the strip. He set it aside with the same clinical detachment he used to fold the cipher earlier. "You recorded the wrong things, Aldrin. You sought to name what the court must hold nameless for safety." His words framed the tribunal's logic. Erasure as protection, absence as a containment strategy. The researcher could answer with rhetoric, but the court would meet rhetoric with the ledger. He moved instead, for a copy of the notation key. The scribe stared at him and then, after a pause, produced a folded paper from his pouch, one of the sealed slips the scribe kept for internal cross-references. He did not hand it over freely. He set it on the table and tapped it twice. The researcher took it and opened it. The notation key was not a simple list. It linked names to procedures, blank lines to signals, and specified who could authorize erasure. It was a catalogue of institutional mechanisms. "This is not a crime list," the researcher said aloud. "It is a system map." He traced the lines and the shorthand with his fingertip. The scribe watched him. Aldrin's eyes narrowed. The researcher realized then that the blank verdict served a function wider than this accused man. The smoke letter had named a target beyond the individual. The notation key connected to other dossiers. The blank was a routing symbol. The ritual had allowed the court to mark persons, networks, and reputations without naming them publicly. The punishment therefore had effects beyond the immediate body burned under the brazier. It reached into wider neighborhoods, into guilds, into households. The researcher felt fear sharpen, not for himself, but for the hidden people who would be marked without knowing why. He confronted the scribe who decides which blanks become verdicts. The researcher asked. The scribe looked away. "We follow orders from Ledger Council and from High Inquisitor Aldrin," he said. "The marks are instruments. They are not questions for us." His voice contained resignation, not aggression. The researcher watched the scribe sink, stained fingers and the small, habitual motion of dipping a quill. The scribe's confession was tacit, delivered in gestures and a small exhalation rather than a direct flat-out statement. That admission counted as a pivot point in the case. Aldrin stepped forward. "You presume culpability of the court," he said, not angrily but as if correcting a procedural error. "You seek to make public what is meant to be handled within our rights." He paused. "We act to prevent contagion in belief. We act to maintain order." His words attempted to justify the instrumentality of erasure. The researcher made one final demand. He for a list of past blanks linked to the same cipher marks. He for names connected by procedure rather than letter. Aldrin was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded and ordered a clerk to bring certain ledgers. The scribe protested softly and then went to retrieve them. The researcher watched the scribe's back as he went, the robe's hem catching the candlelight. When the ledgers arrived, the researcher examined the marginalia and found the same notation repeated across several entries. He traced a line from the cipher fold to an old ledger where another blank had been enacted, and where a family had later been shunned without any formal charge. He read the entry aloud to the room. The ledger recorded consequence, not crime. The researcher spoke plainly and let his words be evidence. "This is not clerical failure," he said. "This is a mechanism of exclusion. The blank ropes people into punishment without naming why." His voice was level. The scribe's hands clenched on the spinal edge of a book. Aldrin's jaw tightened. A brief, sharp argument rose between Aldrin and the scribe. Their exchange was 3 quick rounds of barbed, formal lines, Aldrin insisting ritual necessity, the scribe pointing to established folds and sealed orders. The researcher insisting on transparency for the accused. The accused watched, chin trembling. Guards shifted. The argument was the mid-chapter mini-cliffhanger. Whether the court would permit further inquiry or smother it under ritual process. Aldrin finally conceded a small step. He allowed the researcher a single, supervised review of the related ledger entries and ordered that no further alterations be made until the morning. The court left the room in a procession of cloaks and chains. Only the researcher, the scribe, and the accused remained. The guards lingered at the door. The researcher bent over the ledger, his breath short from the long night. He traced the ledger lines by candlelight and made copies in shorthand. He did not speak much. He recorded names, dates, and the marks that corresponded to blank verdicts. The accused whispered once, "Will that help me?" The researcher answered with a single, plain sentence, "It will show how they move the blame." He did not promise salvation. After the copywork, the scribe closed the ledger with a small, precise motion. He looked at the researcher with an expression that mixed duty and something close to remorse. "You will take these notes," he said, "but be careful who you show them to. The ledger protects the order." The scribe's voice was even. He did not excuse himself. The researcher folded his copies and slid them into his satchel. He then did the last thing he had planned. He took a small portion of ash from the brazier that had cooled with the passage of time and placed it against a strip of paper. He pressed the strip to the ash, leaving a record of the smoke, lettuce removal. That physical smear was now evidence of the tribunal's mechanism. Aldrin watched the movement with a taut expression. "You will account for that sample," he said. The researcher nodded. He had moved from suspicion to curiosity to alarm to clarity and finally into protective action. He had recorded a mapping of the court's blank device. He had also learned that the blank verdict served beyond this accused man. It was a routing tool to mark nodes of influence without public naming. Outside the tribunal, as dawn forced a pale sheet of light into the high windows, the researcher left the hall with his satchel under his arm. He had been ordered to surrender his notebook and had been given limited access. He walked away with copies hidden in seams, with the ash strip in a fold, and with a confession from the scribe that proved the erasure was intentional. He did not speak to anyone as he left. He kept his posture neutral, the cloak heavy on his shoulders. The final action of the night settled the chapter's unresolved motion into a concrete decision. He would map the mechanism, and he would not let the ledger's erasures become a final, unchallengeable silence. He touched the smear of ash through the cloth and felt its still, warm residue. He folded the notebook closed, and then with the deliberate motion of locking a saturated page into a book, he tucked the strip with the ash into a decisive place. The chapter ended on that physical move, the researcher closing the page and slipping the notebook into his satchel. An action that sealed his choice to pursue the named machinery of absence, rather than accept the tribunal's blank as final.